Peace and blessings, everyone. To my friends and fellow New Yorkers, thank you for joining us. People shifted radically and tragically. Peace and blessings, everyone. To my friends and fellow New Yorkers, thank you for joining us. Just over a year ago, at my inaugural State of the People address, I laid out some of the greatest challenges facing New York threats to the people of our city caused new pain. The state of the people was never as secure as many would have liked to believe. Even as everything has shifted in the last year, the underlying force for our city and nation, when in the resounding depths of the Great Depression, it was New York's Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt who answered it, and lifting the country out of an overwhelming, sustained economic emergency. New York City was once shaped by the New Deal, and now we must again be guided by its principles. The impact of FDR's contention that the way through a crisis was not austerity, but investment, is seen across the 5 boroughs in public transportation, public libraries, infrastructure, institution, parks, and programs. Even this building behind me saw investment and improvement under the New Deal. It ushered in an era on the idea that government had the power and obligation to lift people up. The principle that moving forward means moving boldly, intentionally, and very often in defiance of political winds. The New Deal was not meant to be an isolated action, but an ongoing commitment. And in many ways, we have let that deal expire, deepened fault lines, and redirected blame. The current crises are a result not only of external threats, but internal failures of the government to live up to its end of the bargain. And among these crises, the need for recompense to atone for negligence is at its most urgent in decades. And so tonight, I want to extend a renewed deal for New York. Across our city and across issues, we must move forward from this moment with the spirit and intention of renewal, revitalization, and recovery. Our lowest moments are not time to cower, but to construct, to build new systems and reject old excuses. In proposing his New Deal, Roosevelt knew what would be required to enact it: courage and competence. It is those qualities we must now demand to renew New York. The first houses right behind me in Lower Manhattan are so named because this was among the first public housing developments, not only in New York, but across the nation. Constructing these deeply affordable units through the New Deal was a recognition that a lack of accessible housing constituted an immediate emergency then, as it does now. Today, the first houses still operate under NYCHA, a reminder of a promise made but not kept. As the city and state and federal governments have allowed NYCHA to become the worst landlords in New York, while tenants face a crisis built on underinvestment and near criminal mismanagement. It is government's responsibility to ensure safety and shelter, and to make income-targeted housing accessible for New Yorkers in need by expanding rent subsidies and reinvesting in programs like Mitchell-Lama. Housing is a human right, and we have a moral obligation to make that right a reality. Amid the pandemic, the housing emergency has grown exponentially more dire. True housing justice in this time means extending and expanding the eviction moratorium, a true moratorium, and canceling rent rather than leaving thousands of tenants with a bill they cannot possibly pay, and nothing to protect them from losing their homes. Passing good cause legislation and mortgage aid at the state level will further prevent mass evictions and foreclosures. Tenants and property owners alike need relief and a reset. A successful and sustained recovery for housing means enacting more long-term solutions. It means meeting the homelessness crisis by confronting the problem, not trying to cover it up. It means completely rethinking how we develop so-called affordable housing, because everything is affordable to someone. The first houses were created because the existing affordable housing still costs more than double what depression-stricken families could pay. Unfortunately, the first houses also stand as a towering reminder that the New Deal was not a fair bargain for many Americans. By focusing the bulk of its efforts on white, middle, and lower-class families, the federal government entrenched existing inequities. It codified state-sponsored segregation and introduced redlining to cut off communities of more color. The impact of this discrimination went far beyond housing. Those red lines could today trace the areas most deeply harmed by the pandemic, a legacy of oppression that cannot be erased or ignored. We cannot simply build our way out of a crisis with its foundation cemented in segregation. Repairing that harm means working with communities, considering the racial impact of any future development, and cracking down on rental and mortgage discrimination alike. The renewed deal must be an equitable deal. The Bedford Park Boulevard station in the Bronx is part of the independent subway line, a mammoth undertaking which received New Deal funding and is a critical piece of our city's underground infrastructure. Infrastructure may be the most widely recognized component of the New Deal. Our bridges and tunnels, expressways, and express trains bring our city together and connect it to the rest of the world. But it is also the place where New Yorkers most directly see the age of New Deal era projects, the need to rebuild and renew. The systems that support our city and state desperately need our city and state support. Prior to the pandemic, over 4 million people rode our public transit every day. It's a cornerstone of New York, but that cornerstone is crumbling. Delays are mounting, and this infrastructure is in desperate need of revitalization and expansion. Service is decreasing, rates are increasing, and public transportation is becoming inaccessible and unaffordable to the public. In recovery from the pandemic, we need to invest heavily in rebuilding our system while reducing the cost to riders. The Fair Fare programs must be expanded over the next decade to ultimately provide free public transportation. Bus and subway routes need to grow and irrigate transit deserts, and accessibility must be prioritized. Making our subways safer is much more than unaccountable MTA officers. It's about holding the MTA accountable. For New Yorkers traveling above ground, whether on 4 wheels or 2, we need to commit to making our streets safer. With a citywide bikeway and enhanced network of protected bike lanes alongside logical, sensible traffic violation reforms that further penalize the most reckless drivers. We all have a responsibility to pave the way for safer streets. Transportation is not the only utility we can democratize in access and control. The pandemic has shown how crucial it is that every New Yorker has access to quality internet, particularly when so much work and school is now done remotely. We cannot afford service gaps and outages. And speaking of outages, it's time to truly democratize energy by making a municipal energy grid. Public power, as much an institution as the public water supply. Moving toward public power is at the intersection of energy necessity and environmental responsibility. And here we see another way in which the original New Deal must be updated and improved. A renewed deal must center renewable energy and environmental justice, especially for communities left behind by economic advancement or victimized by environmental abuses. The work to get an offshore green energy hub built in Sunset Park is a model to replicate citywide. Whether in making our water free of contamination, our buildings free of harmful emissions, or our job growth sustainable, we cannot choose between economic and environmental justice. Advancing our city means advancing these principles together. One of the more crucial and visible testaments to public investment and its impact on the future is public education. I'm a New York City public school baby and received my high school education right here at Brooklyn Tech. which was the recipient of New Deal funding. I'm incredibly grateful for the time I spent here, the friends I made, the opportunities it created. But this is also a reminder of the inequities that have come from a lack of adequate investment in equitable education, or in removing the barriers that have barred so many from accessing the kind of opportunities we are obligated to provide, including the focus on testing as the sole standard for admission or advancement. I remember all too well the inequities I noticed when I was younger. Unfortunately, they've only gotten worse. To fully support our students, we need to fully resource our public schools. Right now, the halls of Brooklyn Tech are empty, with high school students learning remotely in spite of a strategy pushed by leadership that has long refused to learn a lesson and focus less on rushed reopenings and more on improving remote learning. Reopening buildings will require renovating old systems, innovating new strategies, and rebuilding confidence in our ability to enact them. We all want to be able to reopen schools, but that process must be framed in justice, rooted in equity, and centered on safety. School safety is about more than PPE and ventilation. We need to fundamentally shift the way we keep our students and school staff safe, removing the current police infrastructure from the classroom and destructively punitive measures from our discipline. Investment in restorative justice will divert the school-to-prison pipeline and help our young people truly thrive in academics and beyond. Employment opportunity was a, if not the, core offering of the New Deal, including for young people, a principle reflected today in the Summer Youth Employment Program. Last year, unfortunately, the city cut the SYEP and other youth employment programs when they were most needed. We have fought to regain some funding, but must win not only restoration, but expansion to universal youth employment. Rebuilding our economy also means restructuring it, diverting power from giant corporations and billionaires who are profiting off the pandemic and restoring it to working people who are suffering from it. Investing in small businesses, especially MWBEs, and providing them interest-free loans and grants is critical. Recovery efforts cannot rely on corporations cashing a blank check at the expense of the people. We need good neighbor regulations to require employers coming into New York to hire locally and enrich, not exploit workers and communities, preventing wage theft, providing workers with adequate paid personal time, protecting them from disease or disaster on the job. We cannot call our workers essential and then treat them as expendable. If billionaires are allowed to drive pandemic and post-pandemic policies, then the structural inequities in New York's economy will nevertheless persist. There are simple, common-sense actions widely popular across the state that can raise revenue from the wealthiest New Yorkers. These are not simply actions of revenge, but acknowledgments of responsibility and civic engagement. New York can have a just recovery and build a just economy. We just need some political courage. At Staten Island Borough Hall, which saw major improvements and renovations under the New Deal, we are reminded once again that effective government is not detached or distant. At its best, it is civically engaging constituents, meeting them where they are and serving a shared goal of community empowerment. One of the most important aspects of government enacting major reforms is to reform government itself. Our office acts as a watchdog over New York's elected leaders and agencies, and there are clearly areas of both our city and state operations in need of structural changes, enhanced oversight, and increased accountability. To enact the New Deal, FDR created and flexed executive powers to new levels, which can often lead to more pain than progress when harmful leaders or harmful ideas gain power and influence. The New Deal needs to restore the power of the legislature for the city and state in crafting and passing a budget, allocating funds that will shape New York through this crisis and beyond. It's critical to increase the transparency of these processes and the accessibility that New Yorkers have with their government, particularly when some leaders are transparently trying to prevent access. The Commission on Public Information and Communication, or COPIC, which my office chairs, presents an opportunity to better connect the government to their people, whether through improving public hearings or expanding accessibility of government resources. Perhaps the most direct means for the public to ensure that government represents and responds to them is through our elections. But unnecessary barriers, whether by intentional action or incidental error, have eroded electoral participation in some instances and electoral confidence in others. Now that automatic voter registration will finally be a reality, we need to continue to enfranchise voters through public information campaigns, expand early voting, voting centers, and voting by mail infrastructure, language access, and the successful implementation of ranked choice voting. We also need to commit ourselves to re-enfranchising voters by restoring voting rights to incarcerated individuals and reinstating municipal voting for all New Yorkers, regardless of federal immigration status, a right that was taken away many years ago. City government serves its entire citizenry, all New Yorkers, whether or not they are documented United States citizens. For New York to be a true sanctuary city, we must abolish coordination between city government and the rogue agency that is ICE. We must also move proactively to protect our courts and hospitals from ICE interference and block the sharing of data between state agencies like the DMV and federal immigration officials who would use it to terrorize families and destroy communities. A renewed deal means no New Yorker is sold out. For anyone who is facing immigration court, we must ensure the right to counsel. Throughout this pandemic, we have seen the real life and death consequences of government that, through malevolence or incompetence, fails to respond to the needs of the moment or the people. But we have also seen the power of a people mobilized around changing that government and holding the new government accountable to creating change. If the gains of striking a renewed deal are to hold up, this bargain needs to be upheld. The last year has demonstrated in stark and tragic terms the intersection between public health and public safety. As COVID-19 has exposed and exploited ingrained failures of our healthcare systems, in the streets and on our screens we have seen the demand to end unjust policing, to completely reimagine what public safety means. At the time of the New Deal, when people thought of public safety, it too often meant one thing: simply police. But the reality has always been that public safety cannot be equated with just policing, and that the prioritization of policing has often come at the expense of public health. In Elmhurst, Queens, this police precinct, constructed with New Deal funding, is within a mile of the hospital most overwhelmed by our public health crisis and most underfunded before it. Few places in our country have felt the tragic loss and profound injustice of the pandemic like this neighborhood. Decades of underinvestment in health services created the conditions for the coronavirus to spread most rapidly, the public health system to be overrun most quickly, the pain to be felt most deeply. Much was unknown about the virus at that time, but the existing health disparities and warnings were both known and ignored. Racial inequities and biases, implicit and explicit, have pervaded our healthcare system. Addressing this underlying imbalance requires education, investment, and attention. It is crucial, too, that we provide support to areas of healthcare that have been deliberately cut out of the conversation and the budget in the past. Addiction support services, mental health, sexual health, Black maternal health, healthcare for transgender and gender non-conforming individuals. We need comprehensive strategies to meet the health needs of marginalized communities and take on areas where a lack of attention or resource allocation has caused problems to grow. Concurrent to and compounded by the public health crisis, this year brought a movement for racial justice that spanned the nation in the wake of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. We have to be clear. The national attention and scale of response are unlike we've seen in a very long time, but the abuses that drove the protests and the outrage that ignited them have always been present. The injustices that brought people to the streets this year are ones we have felt in those same streets for decades. We have not been okay. Healing old wounds and building new partnerships will require bold actions and courageous leaders to take them. We cannot be afraid to talk about what defunding the police means, and we cannot be reserved in funding the other systems and services that will define a more just, equitable, and secure vision and reality for public safety. Public safety involves aspects of everything I've discussed tonight, from housing and healthcare to education and infrastructure. Recognizing that and comprehensively developing synchronous strategies is essential. We have already seen successes in the work to co-produce public safety through programs like our crisis management system and the map for neighborhood safety. And now, when we have seen a tragic increase in shootings across the city and this nation post-pandemic, it is the time to expand those programs, which save lives and serve as a model where everyone has a role to play in promoting and protecting public safety. As that work progresses, there are crucial changes we can make immediately, both in how police respond and what they should be responding to at all. We are simply asking our officers to do far too much. and it has been detrimental to police officers, to our community, and to how they interact. Police should not be responding to mental health crises, for example. And I'm glad the city is beginning to catch up with the recommendations of my office and many advocates in that area. Within the department, restrictions on use of force while increasing the CCRB's ability to investigate will provide much needed and long absent accountability and transparency. And just as we need to fundamentally change policing tactics, we must regulate policing tools, ending the DNA and gang databases and banning the use of facial recognition, all of which may not be tools of public safety, but threats to it. We must also shift what is considered to be a threat in law and enforcement. A just legalization of marijuana is long overdue and must include expunging of records and investment in targeted communities. Sex work must be decriminalized. And in the wake of finally repealing the walking while trans ban, we must work to reverse the harm that decades of injustices against trans bodies has wrought. If our state is serious about ending the exploitation of working people, it has to address what amounts to almost slave wages within prison walls, while working to decarcerate and help people access quality employment once they're out. In addition to these supports, we must also prevent the reincarceration that stems from a flawed and punitive parole system by passing the Less is More Act. For those still inside, we need to at last halt solitary confinement, which amounts to torture. This year, more than ever, New Yorkers should be empathetic to the negative physical and mental health aspects of social isolation. Right now, elected leaders are apologizing for policies of the past in the name of being tough on crime, but which devastated communities rather than protecting them, destroyed lives rather than saving them. We cannot repeat these mistakes as we craft and enact a renewed deal. In 2020, we saw and felt the impacts of failed systems of public health and public safety. In the protests so many attended, in the funerals so many could not. Nearly 50,000 New Yorkers have lost their lives to this pandemic, and while no tribute can meet that grief, I want to take a moment of silence now in the memory of all those we lost. Thank you. I wanted to finish tonight's address live, and in the way most of you are watching it, the way we've spent most of the last year, on our screens, in our homes, with just our immediate households. In crises of this unimaginable magnitude, it's easy, it's necessary to think often in broad terms of the loss of lives and livelihood, of the seismic shift in our city, our country, and our world. And of course, it's vital to acknowledge and contend with the scope of the tragedy we have faced and of the trials to come. At the same time, this isn't the crisis of our headlines, but in our homes. It's a human tragedy with personal impact and individual stakes for ourselves and our families. It's about having to adopt our entire way of life and thinking. It's about having a stepdaughter who's learning and living remotely, or a loving partner, trying everything to maintain motivation at home and spirit at work, even while they have become one in the same site. A mother who for months saw us the same way she saw the rest of the world, from the distance of her doorstep. An uncle who passed on without the presence of his family or the promise of a proper memorial. Each of us has these stories and hardships compiled over the last year. They may differ in specifics, but they are united in struggle as we all are. Each of us are united in our isolation by common grief and collective trauma. And in that unity, for me, there is some comfort. I hope we can share in that solace as we move through this recovery. Our solidarity is critical in opposing the virus and in opposing acts of violence blamed on the panic of that pandemic. We must stand together, even if we're apart. It is helpful, I think, to acknowledge this truth. There will be a time when the pandemic does not dominate our attention and our existence. When that time will come, I can't tell you. No one can be certain, as it rests on lowering infection rates, increasing vaccination rates, outrunning new variants, and outperforming old limitations. But it will come. And when it does, gratefully and necessarily, we will move forward. But we can't just move on. We have to resist the temptation to get back to normal, to act as though the last year was an aberration of which we cannot speak, from which we cannot learn, and through which we are not forever fundamentally changed. As a city, and as each of the 8.5 million intersecting individuals who drive it, we can't forget. And I refuse to try. Recovery means remembering. We can't go back. We can't wittingly or unwittingly fall into the same patterns of inequity, injustice, and incompetence that have led us to this moment, only to ultimately repeat it. We cannot retrace our path along the vicious circles we know, but rather use that moment to stir us to action, and action now. Renewal does not mean retreat, and we cannot back down from what we know is a governing imperative and a moral obligation. The renewed deal is ambitious, but it's not theoretical. The solutions I've discussed are as real as the suffering they were meant to alleviate. The constant struggle of New Yorkers against the current of these crises. Our support systems can't be watered down while people are drowning. Enacting the renewed deal, driving this recovery, will not be easy, nor will it be free of error. We are all human. And in that humanity, we know that we will make mistakes. We already have. But we are called upon to admit to those mistakes and accept the accountability that accompanies them, to learn together and to move forward with new information and new ideas. It will take management, vision, understanding, collaboration, and courage, and understanding to lead through this crisis. And while the obligation for this effort falls to the government, the charge goes to each of us. In the depths of the Depression, FDR said that we could resolve to resume this country's uninterrupted march along the path of real progress, of real justice, of real equality for all of our citizens, great and small. He said that out of every crisis, every tribulation, every disaster, mankind rises with some share of greater knowledge, of higher decency, of purer purpose. And I know together we can find that purpose. I'm reluctant to close with someone else's words, so let me instead object to one of FDR's most famous notions, that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Right now, our fears are real. They are understood and shared. I'm often afraid. I think we all are. And so we all must find the courage to match it, because there are things to be feared. But there is also a reason to hope. Hope is essential. It's not the assurance of a promise, it's the embracing of a possibility. Hope and fear are inextricably connected and undeniably similar. Hope is the belief that good cannot come. Hope is the belief, that good can come. Fear, the worry that it will not. Hope and fear, anticipation and dread. I choose hope. I choose to hope. Put another way, I have faith. But as I know, the scriptures that I read says faith without works is dead. From the state capitol and city hall to our boroughs, our blocks, our buildings, we all have to work to enact a renewed deal for New York, to change the state of the people. So let's get to work. Thank you.